Second lecture in part 6. We're now going to get into some of these specific musical movements. I'm going to pick a few out of this great diversity of musical movements that were happening in the 20th century. So we're going to start with Impressionism, which is basically the first musical movement of the 20th century. Started in the late 1800s. It's directly related to the French artistic or art movement called Impressionism that was based on paintings by people like Claude Monet. You can see in the slide this painting by Monet, which was titled Impression Sunrise. This is the painting that gave the Impressionistic movement its name. And so the influence of this in music is most demonstrated by the music of Claude Debussy. So the Impressionist painters focused on color and light and really a sense of impermanence. This is why water was a favorite subject of the Impressionist painters. So when you translate that into music, what you discover is a sense of eliminating all of this harmonic and melodic rigidity that we've seen over the previous couple hundred years. So we look at Claude Debussy. He was the first of the great Impressionists. Impressionistic music started in France, just like Impressionistic art, but then it spread into pretty much every country. In the 20th century, almost every country had a composer who was at least influenced by the Impressionists, if not directly being called an Impressionist. He's usually considered to be one of the great links to the 20th century. Debussy was an interesting character because he was very influenced by the music of Richard Wagner, who we talked about at the end of the Romantic period. Although he rejected Wagner's bombast and just over-the-topness, he's also extremely influenced by Russian music that he heard and the use of different scales that the Russians were using in folk music, and very much Asian music, which he heard for the first time in the late 1800s. Asian musicians were coming to Europe and performing. The Paris Exposition, actually, is where Debussy heard a group from Southeast Asia and was very impressed by the different scales and the different harmonies that they were using. So Debussy studied in Paris. He hung out. He finally, in his 30s, became well known. He lived a life of some degree of luxury, and then he died young at the age of just 50 of cancer. So what he was doing in his music, what all of the musical impressionists did to a degree, was try and get the same ideas across that the painters did. Specifically, they rejected these clear structures and they rejected these clear tonalities and chord progressions, and instead they wanted things to have a sense of impermanence, a sense of just kind of almost drifting. Debussy's music almost all had programs, or the titles at least were very programmatic. Some of his most famous pieces include piano pieces like Clair de Lune, which you're familiar with. Probably you've heard it. I'll put a link to it on YouTube. The Sunken Cathedral, my personal favorite piano work of Debussy's. La Mer, which means the sea, and Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. These are all titles that kind of evoke images without necessarily giving you a specific, clear picture. He was very much into using timbre, experimenting with instruments and using combinations of instruments to create a new sound. His music has a very shimmering quality of sound. And as I said, he also tried to avoid having clearly defined tempos, meters, rhythms, and harmonies. He wanted his music to sound much more free-flowing. To this end, he used scales that other people were not using, like the pentatonic scale. That's missing some of the notes from a regular major scale. Regular major scale here. That scale has some gravity, especially when you go from that half step and then at the top of it, there's gravity on that note. It wants to lead home. By using the pentatonic scale, which skips that note, that's called the leading tone, or a whole tone scale, which sounds like this. Again, we're eliminating that leading tone that wants to take us home. And so by eliminating that leading tone, he eliminates this strong gravity in the melodies. In the harmonies, he used one technique which was called planing, which is essentially where you threw out all the rules of harmony of the previous couple hundred years, where voices wanted to resolve in certain directions to create the chord progression, the sense of one chord pulling us to another chord. And instead, he would just do things like and move these chords in parallel, which eliminated all the sense of gravity that we had in previous eras of music. Really, what he was rebelling against had been the dominant melodic and harmonic forms of music for about 200 years. It all came about in the mid to late 1600s, and then by the late 1800s, he was attempting to establish something new. So, probably his most famous piece, certainly his most famous piece for orchestra, is titled Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. Again, this is a title that is very evocative without being real specific. A faun is a mythological creature, half man, half goat, and it's just the program is basically the faun is hanging out in the forest, kind of waking up, falling asleep, drowsing. Is he asleep? Is he awake? Is he dreaming? We don't really know. I'm going to put two links on YouTube. One is a graphic score, which kind of shows you what's happening in the orchestra. And then another link I'll put on YouTube is to a ballet. Someone choreographed this to be danced. So you can take your pick if you'd rather watch it being danced or watch the graphic score. It's a really cool piece because he uses all of these techniques I just talked about, uses whole tone scales, uses pentatonic scales, uses planing chords, also uses the colors of the orchestra. It starts with the flute in the very low register, which is very beautiful and somewhat unusual sound. He uses harps, he uses strings in a very high and muted register, very softly, just utilizing all of these different techniques of the orchestra to try and create a new timbre that no one had ever heard before. So I'll put up on YouTube links to performances of these pieces. Another movement that was happening in the 20th century was called neoclassicism. Neoclassicism started after World War I. It was for a few reasons. If you think of classical music from what we talked about a few weeks ago, that's the music of Mozart and the music of Joseph Haydn. It's very logical music with very clear chord progressions and very balanced melodies, harmonies, and forms. Everything in classical music, classical period music, is logical and makes sense. Now, as we went through the Romantic period, people pushed and pulled at all of this to create emotion out of the music instead of logic, pure emotion. And then we got to the Impressionists, who were really trying to obscure all of this clarity of form and of harmony and melody and rhythm. Well, the neoclassicists wanted to rebel against what had been happening in music for the previous 100 years or so and go back to clearly structured music with clear chord progressions and straightforward melodies. While it's called neoclassicism, some composers actually were more neo-Baroque and went back all the way back to the music of the Baroque period, Bach and Handel and Telemann, whereas others were more influenced by composers like Mozart and Haydn. It was all about restraining your emotions, making things balanced, making things clear, making things very clearly structured, clearly harmonized, kind of against all of this over-the-top emotion that had been happening in music. While they were doing that, there was still some 20th century stuff creeping in. As a matter of fact, a teacher of mine in graduate school used to call neoclassicism Mozart with funny notes. You'll hear unusual notes in um, some of these compositions, stuff that Mozart never would have written, although a lot of it does sound like Mozart. Another reason people went to neoclassicism is because up until World War I, the orchestras were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and composers were writing for orchestras of 80 or 100 people or even bigger. Well, after World War I, when you got in the 1920s, in a lot of Europe, the economy was kind of a mess. The war had cost billions of dollars in those days funds, so trillions of dollars today. So putting together an orchestra to play a piece that calls for 150 musicians, well, that probably wasn't going to happen. Neoclassicism utilized smaller groups, so this was much more economically feasible, as well as going back to a time of music that was maybe just a little more straightforward and balanced. Maybe people were very traumatized by World War I and wanted to go back to something that was a little simpler. The slide says that I'm going to put up the Pulcinella Suite by Stravinsky, but actually I think I'm going to call an audible on that, and I'm going to put up the Symphony Number 1 by Serge Prokofiev, which is titled the Symphonie Classique, or Classical Symphony. And it is very much, if you look at the orchestra, the size of the orchestra, it looks a lot like what Mozart would have written for. If you listen to it, it sounds a lot like Mozart or Haydn, but it's got some differences. It's got some dissonances and some rhythmic things that those composers never would have thought of. Now, the leader of neoclassicism was Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky was a brilliant musician. He's actually, in many ways, like Miles Davis. If you remember, we talked about Miles Davis back when we were talking about jazz. Miles Davis, many great musicians find what they're good at, and that's what they do for the rest of their life. They stick with that style. They may develop and grow within that style, but they pretty much stick with what they were good at. Whereas Miles Davis was never happy with, he was a bebop trumpet player, but he more or less invented cool jazz and helped to invent jazz rock fusion as well. Stravinsky was kind of like Miles Davis in that he had four very specific periods of composing. He was never happy to keep writing things the same way. He reinvented himself constantly. So Stravinsky is probably the most influential composer of the 20th century. He got his first big break. He was in his early 20s when he wrote a ballet. He's most famous for his ballets. The first ballet he wrote that gave him a big break was called The Firebird. It's based on the legend of the Phoenix. The second ballet he wrote was called Petrushka. And then the third ballet he wrote, this was world premiered in 1913, just over 100 years ago, was called The Rite of Spring. And this is maybe the most influential groundbreaking piece of music of the 20th century. It's a ballet, a little over half an hour long, split into two acts. And it's essentially about the program, the libretto, if you will, is about, a few thousand years ago, there are groups of people, tribes of people living out in Siberia, a very cold, very difficult place to survive. And it's the end of winter, and a fortune teller comes to town. Well, it's not a town, they don't have towns, but comes to the encampment of the tribe and casts some fortunes and says, oh, spring's not going to come because the gods are angry. Well, why are the gods angry? Well, who knows why gods are angry, but what they decide is the village elder comes out, and the village elders decide in order to appease the gods, they have to do a human sacrifice, because that's what you do in primitive cultures, is you have to have a human sacrifice. So they select one young virgin from the village, from the tribe, and she is ordered to dance herself to death. That's the second half. The first half sets it all up. The second half, they prepare the chosen sacrifice, and she dances herself to death. This is an incredibly violent piece of music. It's actually from a subset of a style which was called primitivism. So there's a ton of percussion. The time, the meter and the tempos change constantly. It's very, very difficult to tap your foot to. It's very dissonant, very harsh, and the way he uses the instruments really pushes the instruments technically. It starts with a bassoon playing very softly in its extreme upper register. It's supposed to sound very strained. And then when the curtain comes up, now this is pretty cool, because at its world premiere performance, it caused a riot. When the curtain came up, and I'll talk about this in our class on Tuesday, the dance, the choreography, the costuming, the music, everything was so different than what anyone had ever heard before or seen before that some people immediately started yelling at the stage. Other people said, hey, you want to shut up? I'm trying to watch this ballet here. And the audience actually got into a fight. It was so loud, the riot in the audience was so loud that the dancers couldn't hear the music. And Stravinsky was standing off stage counting with a little megaphone, counting out numbers so the dancers could stay together. Now, 100 years later, the piece is it's very common. It's played by orchestras all the time. It's choreographed and danced all of the time. But 100 years ago, it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Now, this was from Stravinsky's Russian period, what they call his Russian period, his first major compositional period. When he got in the 1920s is when Stravinsky shifted into neoclassicism, and then even later he shifted into writing atonal music, which takes us to Expressionism. Expressionism is another artistic movement of the 20th century. It came primarily out of Germany and Austria, whereas Impressionism came mostly out of France. Expressionism came out of Germany. Where Impressionism was kind of trying to create very soft, gentle emotions, Expressionism was creating very harsh, aggressive emotions in a way that people hadn't really done before in art. The most famous expressionist piece of art is titled The Scream by Edvard Munch. You can see it here in the slide. It's one of the most famous paintings of the last 100 years. As a matter of fact, it's been parodied so much that, quite frankly, it's lost probably most of its value to shock because it's just been people have redone it in so many different ways. But in musical expressionism, it was a use of dissonances, extreme high and extreme low, very strident timbres and tonalities, and essentially avoiding traditional, comfortable sounds out of the musicians. It was used as a form of social protest to a large degree, or an attempt just to address more ugly and difficult topics that had not been addressed before in music, and to shock the audience. As we talked about in the first couple chapters, in the 20th century, shocking the audience was actually considered to be a good thing that musicians and artists wanted to do. Now, the leader of the Expressionist music was Arnold Schoenberg. Schoenberg was German. Um, he was Jewish, so when the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, he, along with a lot of great musicians and artists, was forced to flee Germany, and he moved to America. I believe he lived in Southern California. Now, Schoenberg took Expressionism further than anyone had even thought, and he got to a point where he actually completely abandoned any semblance of key. He created music that had no tonal center whatsoever. So whereas someone like Debussy was trying to obscure the tonal center, Schoenberg completely did away with it and developed an entirely new system of writing notes so that every note was equal. There was no gravity pulling you to a specific note through a specific chord progression. It was brilliant. It was intellectually brilliant and groundbreaking. And he did have his followers, people that thought it was a brilliant system and copied him and studied with him. People named Alban Berg and Anton Webern became very well-known musicians who studied with Schoenberg. But overall, it's never been a popular style among audiences. It's a very difficult style to hear and to understand. It's the kind of music that you might have to listen to 15 or 20 times before a piece starts to make sense to you, and most people aren't going to put that amount of time into it. He was always inventing not just new tonal systems, but new systems of timbre, and he developed this technique called Sprechstimme, which literally means song speech. It's kind of halfway between singing and speaking. You're not singing full voice, but you're not really speaking either. It does happen on a pitch. So I'll put up a couple of pieces by Schoenberg. They're short pieces to just give you an idea. The first one is titled Pierrot Lunaire and makes extensive use of Sprechstimme in the vocal. And then the second one is titled Survivor from Warsaw, which was written about the murder by the Nazis of all the Jews in Warsaw, Poland. And it's a very intense piece of music, very difficult to listen to. So, but it's not very long at all. It's only about 4 minutes long. So I'll put up on Blackboard links to all of the music that I've talked about in these chapters. And then this has all been focusing on Europe. I'll put up one more lecture that's going to talk more about what was happening in America during the 20th century.